So what pushes an entire country to the breaking point, to rise up against its own rulers? Well, today we're going to dive into exactly that. We're looking at the explosive start of one of the most important events in all of history, the French Revolution.
Okay, let's kick things off with just one number, 98%. Now, you got to remember this number, because it is the absolute key to understanding everything that's about to happen. It stands for the huge, overwhelming majority of the people in France, a group that had been silenced for centuries but was finally about to find its voice.
So who exactly made up this 98%? Well, pretty much everybody. Just try to imagine this for a second. You live in a country where you, your family, your neighbors, almost everyone you know, pays for everything, all the taxes. But you have zero say in how the country is run. None. For most people in France, that wasn't imagination. That was their everyday reality.
And that's the big question, right? That's what this is all about. We're going to see what happens when that massive 98% decides they've had enough, when they finally find their voice. It's a story that didn't just turn their world upside down, it literally changed the course of history forever. So, let's set the scene here. We're in the late 1700s, and from the outside, France looks like a superpower. It's glamorous, it's powerful, but underneath all that glitter, the kingdom was about to completely fall apart. It was like a perfect storm brewing, a real recipe for disaster.
First ingredient in this disaster? The country was broke. I mean, completely, totally broke. The king, Louis XVI, was spending money like it was going out of style, on expensive wars, on his incredibly luxurious court at the Palace of Versailles. Things got so bad that the government was spending half of its entire budget just paying the interest on its loans. It was an economic nightmare.
Okay, ingredient number 2, the way society was set up. It was super rigid. Everyone was divided into 3 groups, which they called estates. You had the first estate, that's the clergy, church leaders. Then the second estate, the nobility, the rich landowners. And then the third estate, which was, well, everyone else. And the thing is, the group you were born into, that pretty much decided your entire life.
And this is where that 98% number comes crashing back in. See, the first and second estates, the clergy and the nobles, they only made up about 2% of the population, a tiny fraction. The third estate, that's our 98%, was everybody else. We're talking poor farmers, city workers, doctors, lawyers, the massive, overwhelming majority of the country.
So what you had was this incredibly lopsided system. A tale of two Frances, really. On one side, you've got this tiny, privileged 2%. They owned most of the land, held all the powerful jobs, and get this, paid almost no taxes. On the other side, you have the 98%. They paid for everything, taxes to the king, to the church, to their landlords, had no say in government, and were struggling just to afford food. It was completely unfair, and that tension was about to snap.
And if all that wasn't bad enough, there was a third ingredient to this whole disaster. Just when you thought things couldn't possibly get any worse, well, the weather turned against them. A natural disaster came along and pushed everyone right to the edge. Okay, so a bunch of bad harvests and some really awful weather led to a huge shortage of grain. Now, why does that matter? Because grain means bread, and bread was what almost everyone ate to survive. So the price of bread just went through the roof. We're talking from a small part of your daily pay to costing an entire week's wages for just one loaf. People were literally starving. So, King Louis XVI knew he was in deep trouble. The country's bankrupt, people are starving in the streets. He had to do something, and fast. So he came up with a desperate, last-ditch plan.
His big idea was to call a meeting of the Estates General. Now, this was a kind of emergency parliament, with people representing all 3 estates. But get this, it hadn't been called for over 175 years. That's how you know things were bad. The king's plan was simple. He hoped this assembly would agree to new taxes on the privileged classes, the ones who had been getting a free ride.
But there was a problem, a huge problem. Before they could even start talking about taxes, the whole thing ground to a halt over one single question. But it was a question that would change everything. How should they vote?
Yeah, the voting system was the deadlock. The old way was to vote by estate. That meant the first estate got 1 vote, the second estate got 1 vote, and the huge third estate also got 1 vote. You can see the problem, right? The 2 privileged estates could always team up and outvote the people 2-1. So the third estate proposed a new idea, vote by head. 1 person, 1 vote. That was the only way their 98% majority would actually mean something.
So for weeks, they just argued and got absolutely nowhere. The first and second estates weren't going to give up their power. So finally, the third estate had enough.
They realized the whole system was rigged against them, and if they wanted change, they were going to have to make it happen themselves.
So on June 17, 1789, they did something incredible. They just walked out, and they declared themselves the National Assembly, saying, "We are the real voice of the French people." This was a massive deal. It was a direct challenge to the king's authority. It was a revolutionary act.
And the king? Oh, he was not happy. He tried to shut it all down immediately. He had the doors to their meeting hall locked, just locked them out. But if he thought that was going to stop them, he was very, very wrong. It just made them even more determined.
So they find their meeting hall locked. What do? They just moved down the road to an indoor tennis court? And right there, on that tennis court, they took a famous oath. They swore they would not give up, they would not go home until they had written a new constitution for France. They were sending a message: we are not backing down.
Now, while all this political drama was happening with the politicians in Versailles, back in the city of Paris, the mood was turning ugly. People were hungry, they were angry, and rumors were flying that the king was sending the army in. The city was a powder keg, just waiting for a spark.
And on July 14, 1789, that powder keg exploded. Parisians, scared the king's troops were coming, started looking for weapons. A huge crowd marched on the Bastille. Now, the Bastille was this old, grim fortress right in the middle of the city. It was a prison, and to the people, it was a symbol of the king's brutal power. And after a furious battle, the people took it. The fortress fell.
The fall of the Bastille was more than just a battle. It was a signal. It showed everyone, plain and simple, that the king was losing control. He couldn't even control his own capital city anymore. That's why this event is seen as the moment the French Revolution truly began.
So the Bastille has fallen, the revolution is on, and the National Assembly, now backed by the power of the people in Paris, wasted no time. They started to tear down the old unfair system piece by piece.
And the changes they made were huge. I mean, in just a few weeks, they got rid of all the special privileges for the nobility, no more free ride on taxes. They released this incredible document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, basically saying everyone is born free and equal. And that old system of the three estates, gone, destroyed, forever.
So the revolution proved that the people had the power to tear down a system they thought was unfair. But what comes next? That's always the hardest part, isn't it? It's one thing to destroy an old world. It's something else entirely to build a new one. And for France, that journey to build something new was just beginning. It would be long, chaotic, and often violent.